And welcome back to our afternoon sessions. We are joined by the lovely Mike House, live from Perth. I've known Mike for a few years now, but he's spent 20 years as a leading survival specialist, and he now works with leaders and teams who want to thrive and adapt in uncertain times. His tools are described as tactical with real-world applicability, and Mike's insights explain how human behaviour and blind spots give us useful hacks to deal with pressure and shift ineffective thinking. Having observed himself and countless others in the extremes of deprivation and duress, Mike is uniquely positioned to offer profound and practical insights into effective and sustainable action under pressure. He's worked with businesses of all sizes and all sectors across Australia, and is the author of 2 books, Thrive and Adapt, No Matter What, and Unshakable, More Than Resilience. Mike, it's so great to have you here. I love your story. I cannot wait to actually get into it in more detail. So I'm going to hand straight over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Julia. Thanks for the invitation to be part of VID21, and thanks for hosting this space. It was a really vital conversation last year in the midst of COVID, and as we're coming out the other side of that, I think access to great thinkers from here in Australia and around the world has been a real gift to the community. So thanks very much for bringing that together. So welcome wherever you're listening and dialing in from, whether you're here live or watching the recording here in Australia or somewhere global. Welcome to you. My name's Mike House, and as Julia said, I spent 20 years working as a survival instructor in one of the world's leading arid area survival schools. I'll just throw up a quick slide there for you. To very arid, we would give people a soapbox-sized survival kit, 2 litres of water to start, and whatever clothes they were standing up in, and they would walk for 200 kilometres over the course of 10 days, finding all their own food and water along the way. So it's a pretty arduous thing. This is Perth, circled in red there in Western Australia, and the Pilbara, the region that we were in, is about 1,800 kilometres north, or a bit over 1,000 miles for those of you in that version, and really dry, really remote area of Australia, pretty full on country. So the you could say that that was a bit like Bear Grylls, but I reckon it's just like that, only real. Because some of Bear's stuff is a little bit dodgy. So for example, he'd tell you to drink your own wee to stay hydrated. And as a survival specialist, I thought it'd be a good idea to find out the validity of that. And I'd have to say I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about field trials. I thought I'll ask professional medical people what their opinion was. So I asked the question, and universally they said, Mike, if you're dehydrated, toxins in the top that you're putting out the bottom is not a good idea. It's not a good strategy. Most of them said if you were that dehydrated that you were thinking about it, you'd probably stop weeing anyway. And a doctor mate of mine, he eyeballed me, he got up really close and he said, Mike, it would actually be better off drinking somebody else's. And I don't know about you, but that didn't lift it up the scale of things to try soon at all for me. Occasionally people would ask me a question that I always found hilarious. It was, what's your success rate as a survival instructor? And I used to think, well, if it was anything less than 100%, it'd be false advertising, wouldn't it? You could imagine me leaping out of the bushes if 10 of you turned up in that remote area. G'day, I'm Mick, your survival instructor. I've got a 98% success rate. And you'd be looking at each other going, bloody hell, I wonder who's not going to make it. So usually when we get about here, people are, the room is roughly divided into thirds, I find. So there's a third of you who are thinking, this guy is a lunatic. Make sure that I am never exposed to him and the bush at the same time. There's around about a third of you who are going, that's great, where do I sign? And there's around about a third of you who are going, well, that's really interesting, but so what? What's it got to do with me in my world and where I am right now? And for me, there was this really interesting piece that I realized one day sitting on a rock out there, and you'd know it anyway if you've been on the planet for any amount of time. And that is that we all face circumstances, and then there's our response to those circumstances. And the circumstances, if you watch closely, actually don't dictate the response, do they? You can have two people in an identical circumstance. One sees opportunity and all sorts of potential, and the other's in a victim tailspin, just going, oh, this is really terrible. I don't know what to do next. So I got very fascinated over the last couple of decades about what's on that line. What makes the difference between people who do well, particularly when the circumstances are difficult to deal with, and what are some of the skills and attributes that they use? And my two books, Thrive and Adapt and Unshakable, are really about that topic. There's been a bunch of research about this. So these couple of books up on the shelf, The Survivor Personality, which was written by a guy called Al Siebert. He was probably the originator of some of that research in psychology about a thing they call the survivor personality. And it looks at people who defy the odds and either thrive or at the very least survive and potentially thrive when things are not going well. And the research spans the full range of humans under pressure. So there's the lost and stranded in the outback kind of scenario. There's dire medical diagnoses where people are, handed a really grim diagnosis and given months to live. There's people going bankrupt, people going through relationship breakups. There's people whose business relationships fracture and spin off in lots of different directions. And across that full range of endeavour, they have identified a number of characteristics that are always there with the people that do well. And what's fascinating about that is some of these people actually seem to be able to stack the deck in their favour, even though it's clearly not. They're able to take the circumstances they're served, and their response to it is so good that they're actually able to make something out of it. And from my point of view, that's a really useful skill set. So I dug even further into that, and I went looking for, are there any of those characteristics that apply across all of those people and all of those circumstances? And I reckon it boils down primarily to one. Someone's just asked for a photo snapshot of that book, and I'll certainly do that. The one thing that all of those people have is a capacity to look at the things that are inside of their control and to take massive action there. So I'm just going to sketch up a bit of a model. You don't have to adjust your TVs. This is actually a bright yellow wall behind me, and it's a bit shiny because it's a whiteboard. So I'm just going to sketch up a bit of a model there that's in the Unshakable book, and we'll get into it and use it a little bit for, how do you triage situations where you're feeling overwhelmed and under pressure? How do you make decisions about where should your energy and resources and time go? So let's plow into that. So it's like a lot of really good models. It's pretty simple. It starts with 3 circles. And the middle circle, some of you will have seen this before because it was made pretty popular by Stephen Covey in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But it's actually way older than that. And we'll get into its history a little bit in a minute. So in the middle here is the circle of control. What are the things that are directly within your control? And for me, looking at that is always simultaneously a little bit liberating and a little bit terrifying. It's liberating because what's in that bucket is actually pretty small. It really comes down to what I say, what I do, what I think, and that's kind of it. There's not much else that's genuinely in the circle of control. And what I mean by control here is if you take an action, there is a direct result, and your action directly precedes that result. It's kind of a predictable chain. There's nothing else in the middle that complicates it. So, if I want to stay hydrated, I drink water. If I want to reduce conflict around me, I speak calmly and with respect. They're things that are directly within my control. It's a little bit terrifying because that circle is actually really small as well. Sometimes I look at it and I go, what is that? Surely there's more. And it can be quite frustrating to genuinely acknowledge how little we actually have control over. So that one characteristic I was talking about in the survivor personality is that people are very, very good at identifying what's in this circle. And they're very good at choosing the parts of that that will have the greatest impact in the circumstance they're in right now, and then just taking action on that. They don't waste time or energy on things that are outside of their control. So as an example of that, I don't know what it was like where you are, but here in Western Australia, we've had a fairly easy run with COVID. We've had very few cases and very, very limited exposure to lockdowns that have been really prevalent in other parts of the world. We've had a couple of them, but they've been really short and pretty easy. When it came to the run up to New Year's this year, there were a lot of people going, oh, thank God 2020's over and that'll be the end of COVID. And in my mind, I was going, that's not in this circle. You know, there's people putting markers and expectations into their circumstances that are probably unrealistic. And the result of doing that is that, you know, when we had our short, hard lockdown in early February, there were a lot of people that were very stressed because they've set this expectation that that's all over, it's in the past, rather than focusing on things that they can genuinely control and get a handle on. The second circle out is the circle of influence. And that's a really important circle too. So these are things where I don't directly have control, but I most definitely can influence outcomes. And that's usually anything involving other people. So if Julia was, you know, if we were pushing time later on and I've been jabbering on for ages and she's like, I've really got to get to the next session, she could influence me. There's a number of ways that she could do that. So a simple way would be to stick something in the chat to say, time's up, Mike, time to wrap up. A more direct and abrupt way would just go end meeting. And, you know, it's all over. I could carry on talking if I wanted to, but the game's over. So there's always a choice in influence about whether we do or don't influence somebody, and then what kind of tactics we might use. And for me, this is an area, particularly if I'm overwhelmed, I will pare back what's in my circle of influence significantly. I'll focus more here and do less work out in the circle of influence. Part of the challenge there, and I see a lot of people building stress for themselves when they confuse these two lines. So I don't know about you, but there's times where I feel like I should be able to control somebody else. A good example is, you know, a number of the people I work with who supervise teams, they say, well, I should be able to issue an instruction and expect a result from my team. And it doesn't sound like an unreasonable expectation, but they're playing here. They're playing in the circle of influence. For a start, they've got to be sure that the people have actually understood what they've had to say about the instruction. And that in itself is pretty interesting. One of my favorite quotes of all time is George Bernard Shaw. The main problem with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. You know, we say things, we write things, and we expect that there's an understanding of them, but there's often a pretty large gulf between what was said and what was understood. So that's part of the circle of influence. Another great example is parents trying to control their kids cleaning up the room. You know, clean your room. And when they're really young and they think you're the center of the universe and control everything, they'll probably just go, yes, mum or dad. But then later on, it becomes an increasingly challenging game of influence to get them to comply with the things that are your expectations, not theirs. When we think we can directly control something that's only in our influence, that does our head in. So one of the best things you can do for personal stress, I reckon, is just get really clear about that line. Is this in my control directly or not? And if it is about influence, then what's the most effective way that I can play the influence game in this circumstance with that person or group of people. For a start, we can choose whether we have the capacity to do it. The fact that we're just consciously acknowledging that there might be some compromise there means that we have some more flexibility and lightness around the outcomes. And then we can intentionally choose what's the best tactic. You know, do I put something in the chat to say, Mike, time to stop, or do I go end meeting? You know, we've got a number of different ways we could go. The last circle here is the circle of concern. And that is about things that we need to pay attention to because they're important in our world, and they could have either significantly beneficial or significantly dire consequences. And if we don't pay attention to them, we run the risk of being blindsided by something huge. We'll just talk through a little scenario here that probably outlines all three of those really clearly. So in Australia, up in that northwest part where we used to run survival courses, there's regular cyclones, big storm events. In other parts of the world, they call similar things hurricanes or typhoons. And they spend a good few days building up off the coast, and then they storm across the coast. And there's usually winds up to a couple of 100 k's an hour, and lots of damage and heaps of rain. And all of the towns and properties up there are built for that kind of condition. So whenever a storm is coming, there's a warning, you know, batten down all of the stuff that's loose, make sure there's no piles of rubbish lying around, particularly things that if they started flying about in the wind would cause damage, put storm shutters up, that sort of thing. So in my control is the piles of stuff that I might have in my backyard. I can tidy those up, weight them down, put the protective shutters over my windows. I might have a neighbour who has a big pile of garbage in his backyard that will definitely become a problem when the wind starts to blow. And if I want to change that, that is a game of influence. I can't directly control what he does with his pile. So I could choose a number of strategies. You know, I could hang over the back fence and with a couple of beers late one afternoon and say, hey, how about we have a couple of beers and I give you a hand with the pile, and we could get it done that way. It may be that it's a better tactic to have a quick conversation with his wife when I saw her down the street and say, could you just have a word to Bill about the pile in the backyard? It might be that this is an ongoing issue, and a better approach is call the Shire Council and get them to send a ranger around and take a more heavy-handed formal approach. But how I choose that will affect how effective it is in terms of outcome. The circle of concern is the storm itself. You know, I could go down to the beach, and I think a lot of us do this kind of thing metaphorically. Could go down to the beach, face into the wind and scream at the storm, you know, turn back, you know, end it all, no wind, go away, don't want you. It doesn't matter what I do, that storm's not in my control. It's coming whether I like it or not. And the best thing I can do is be prepared. So there's a real discipline in focusing on the stuff that's here and picking the pieces of it that are the most effective for the situation that we're in. One of the things that we often bolt onto this, which I think is really effective as well, is to think about gratitude. So that comes up in all of these books over and over again as well. That one of the things in people's control is how grateful they are. And even in dire circumstances, if we've got a sense of gratitude about things that are going well, then that has a profound impact on our psychology. It's one of the most positive things we can do for our state of mind. And I need to be clear here that we're not talking about gratitude in the sense of sort of rose-colored glasses. There's that sort of hashtag Insta-worthy, woohoo, so happy, you know, really shallow kind of gratitude that we sometimes see. And, you know, if you're talking to, I was having this conversation a couple of weeks ago with a friend in Perth whose 3-year-old son has recently been diagnosed with a pretty dire form of cancer. And we were talking about gratitude, and, you know, there's a logical kind of question in there about, well, what's to be grateful for? You know, things are pretty bad for her and her family right now. and yet she was saying, you know, there's many things that we're finding to be grateful for, and we're finding that that's really important. So I think there's a line in here about being, it's not about denying reality. It's not about just trying to pep yourself up. It's this ability to balance the circumstance, what you're actually facing, the reality of that, with a sense of there's some good and shining lights in this as well, and that gets us through. Some of the people that have survived quite extended pieces of being stranded and alone in various bits of wilderness, you know, they talk about, I wasn't sure that I was going to survive through the night. You know, it's literally that tight. They think that they're going to die. Their approach is, I'm going to take everything that I can do to make sure that I'm still here tomorrow morning, and I'm really going to enjoy the sunset. That mindset, I think, is quite profound. I know for me, don't know what it's like for you, but for me, sometimes when circumstances feel like they're turning against me, it's very easy to fall into that kind of victim mindset, to be to feel as though the situation's conspiring against you, and that somehow that's undeserved, and you know, we put all sorts of judgments on that. The most useful place that I can arrive is to say, it just is what it is. Now, what can I do that makes the best of it for me in this moment?
It's come up in VID a few times, particularly power, or like you talk about, you know, standing on the beach and the storm coming towards you. Sometimes that storm is another person. So it might be a leader, or someone that's more powerful than you in some respect.
Yeah.
And you're not actually surviving a storm or surviving, being in a remote part of the wilderness. You're actually trying to survive a particular situation at work. Do you find you might not see the storm coming, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
You kind of get from control into concern without having time to realize what you can influence.
Yes. Yeah. When say you're talking about situations where the storm arrives completely unexpectedly with no forecast, it's just all of a sudden you're in the middle of it. There wasn't any time to prepare.
No.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and I think that there's kind of two ways that I would slice that. The whole sort of premise of this book, Unshakable, is it's really about those moments of impact in life are unavoidable. So and they've got different durations. So when I say a moment of impact, that could be a situation like you're talking about, where someone just storms across your horizon and unloads whatever the equivalent of rain and thunder is. And it might be literally just a moment that it's done and it's gone and it's past, or it could be something that grinds on for ages and ages and ages, potentially years. So when I say moment, duration is not necessarily short. I think in many cases, the realization that you've got a set of circumstances that are not ideal, that are not of your choosing or making, there's a sense in which it knocks us. I know it certainly does for me. And the prologue of that book is actually describing a trip back from Queensland shortly after my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. We need to just push pause there and say she's now fine, 5 years on, cancer clear, everything great. But I was flying back from Queensland, and, 2 days before I left, we'd got that call that says, you need to come back for another appointment. And you don't get those calls for, we're just going to tell you everything's okay, because they do that in the mail. But they don't tell you anything more than that. And so that's an example of something pretty big landing unanticipated, nothing preceding it to sort of give us any warning. And usually for me, there's a bit of a moment of scramble in there. And again, the moment can be short or long, where you notice yourself getting significantly knocked off kilter. The reason that we put the in Unshakable in brackets is the reality is we all are. And I don't know that we actually want to even build ourselves or aspire to build ourselves to a state where we're so armored up that things can't get to us. I think that would make us less than human.
Yeah.
So we can be shaken. The question is, what do we do after that? And for me, this tool is one of those ways that we can fairly quickly triage things. So, you know, if something's happened completely unexpectedly, I often will pull this thing out either in my head or on the back, just the back of a scrap piece of paper. Okay, so what can I control about that? You know, if the boss is treating me badly, and you know, there's a long list of stuff in the media just now about just how bad that can be here in Australia. Then what can I control directly, you know, and what do I need to do about that? And that could be up to and including I could leave, if that's the best and safest thing to do. And when I said before, this box is quite liberating, I think when you can fully pull into your awareness all of the options that are available to you, even though some of them may be less desirable, it gives you a sense of, oh, okay, now I've got a little bit of choice. So that sense of choice takes the pressure off a little bit, I think. That's a really good example, I think, Julia, of how you might go about playing this game here. So, you know, there was an interesting post today on LinkedIn from a friend of mine about some of the calls for changes to violence against women. And one of the conversations that was happening in there was, you know, there are some men who just arc right up at any mention of that, get really defensive, try to say that there's no issue or it's being blown out of proportion. And they were saying, you know, I've reached a point where I actually don't try to influence that conversation anymore because it seems to be a waste of time. They've got a very entrenched view and I'm not going to go anywhere. So that's a really conscious choice to say I'll operate here or I won't. Other people might choose the complete opposite. You know, it's an important conversation. I think we need to invest time there. But recognizing it as a choice, I think, is really important. How much energy have I got for this? How much do I want to push it? And then post-event, you could go, all right, well, that person's still going to be around. We're still going to have that issue. What else is involved in that and how might it play out? Just gives us a bit of a heads up view of what might be coming. And it's by necessity almost always incomplete. Yeah. You know, we only have to look at COVID for that. There wasn't too many people prior to that forecasting it and going, this will impact the entire world. And the few voices that were saying that were probably being regarded as a little bit out there and conspiracy theorists before it actually happened. So it's great if we can, I think we can go in two directions. So if we know there's stuff here that is coming that will have an impact, then let's keep an eye on it and respond accordingly. And we can work back in this way then. If we've been dropped in something that was completely unanticipated, then start here and work your way out.
Yeah. And I think, as you said at the beginning, when you had the picture of the Pilbara up, you can still prepare yourself for kind of most eventualities as well, can't you? Like, I remember when I was up in far north Queensland when I first came over to Australia and was driving through probably 80 kilometres east of Mount Isa, which is, you know, the middle of nowhere by anyone's sort of rough calculations, and just stumbled across two people whose vehicle had broken down.
Yes.
Freaking out. No, one of them was, you know, in shorts and a t-shirt, no hats, no boots, no water, no maps, no, like, and the fact that we just stumbled across them is probably, you know, borderline miracle, to be honest.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
they hadn't proactively taken control of that what might happen as well. I think is my insight. What you were sharing is yeah, we might not be able to prepare for every eventuality, but we can, if we know our boss is a bit of a nightmare, we can, even if we can't influence them, we can certainly prepare for the downpour to keep the weather metaphor going.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's people often ask me about scenario planning, and how far should you dive into imagining yourself in various situations that are less than desirable, and how extreme and or fanciful should those scenarios be. And for me, I think there's a really great value in that. And what it is it creates a nimbleness of mind for when you're in the situations that you'll actually face. I think there's absolutely 0 point in scenario planning with the specific intention of, I want to plan for X, Y, Z. And I think the extreme case of that is doomsday preppers, right? They go, well, the world will end and it will end in this way. And so I'm investing 100% of my time, energy, resources in this solution. And if their prediction comes true, they'll have the best told you so story in the history of humanity. But if almost anything else happens, they're screwed, because they're so single channel. So for me, this is about, all right, how can I think about and test myself across a variety of different situations with the intent of being lighter and more nimble of mind and of skill, so that whatever happens, I'll have some way of digging myself out of that victim hole, which is a really easy one to fall into, especially when something unexpected drops. And then how quickly can I get myself back to the most functional state possible, and work from there. And so that kind of scenario thinking, I reckon we can get as ridiculous as you like. It kind of doesn't matter, go dream up asteroids and volcanoes that cover the place in clouds of ash, and more immediate, close to home things like, well, what if your house burns down, or what if you can't communicate via technology anymore? And some of those things might happen, they might not. The third domain out here is ineffective concern. So we don't want to load our mind up with things that are stressful, but we really don't need to worry about them. But I think that kind of game, if we can keep it light, and that's the key to me, it's if you're doing that kind of scenario thinking and it's impacting negatively on your psychology, then probably stop it. But if you can do it at a level of, okay, a bit playful, what if this, what if that, what if that, and you think through the kinds of things that might be in your control, the kinds of things you might influence, then when real stuff happens, it means that you can play, I think, more effectively and more rapidly out of that low state into something more effective, where you feel like you've got some genuine control over it.
Yeah. Wendy said in the chat that she's terrible at the victim mentality, or maybe she's good at it. I really like your practical advice about being grateful, and also about being where you've arrived and not needed to stay there. So
yeah,
being
spot
able to
on,
move,
Wendy.
as you said.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. For me, I think all of these states are fluid. So, we can all arrive in a victim space if the right set of circumstances pile up. We've all got buttons that can be pushed by people. We've all got our own loops of self-talk that can run us into dark places that are not particularly useful. And we've all got the capacity for resilience and for better choices and more effective. And for me, it's more about how do we bridge those two sides of our own river than it is about being one or the other. The reason I called the book More Than Resilience is I think resilience gets a little bit of a inflated sense of importance in, we certainly saw it a lot with COVID, people running around saying, what we need is people to be more resilient. That'll fix it. And from my point of view, there's three things that I know beyond doubt about resilience. One is, if you're a human being, you have it in spades. already. You have already dealt with an enormous amount of challenges and you've managed to get through them somehow. And it's actually one of the phenomenal traits that human beings have, you know, both individually and collectively. We are legendary at seeing something coming or being surprised by it and adapting to it and dealing with it. That doesn't mean that it's easy. So I think the second point is that a lot of people interpret resilience as if I've got that, I'll just kind of sail through everything as if I'm coated in Teflon and I'll never have any issues or problems. And that's a delusional mistruth, I think, where we kind of feel like, oh, I should be kind of impervious in some way. It's like, no, we're not going to be like that. Yeah. You know, it doesn't take much thinking for any of us to realize that there's some things in our life where if that happened, you know, like if I lost my partner, that would be a big deal. It would take a while to recover from that. If my health was really bad, that would be something that would really knock me. You know, for some of us, work is really important. So if we weren't able to do the kind of work that we do and we had to adapt that would be really challenging. So I think we've got to recognize that resilience isn't Teflon coated, impervious to those situations. It's actually about being able to deal with the fear and potentially despair that arises in those situations and find a way through it or over it, and often to come out the other side better and stronger than we were.
Yeah. I know, and then when I talk to my clients about, you know, change and business transformation, and they say, oh, you know, we need strong leaders. We need them to be stronger. Like it is that sort of, to them, resilience is strength. And I get it all the time, you know, with a surname like Steele. You know, it's just like, we need strong. We need them to be tough. And you know, it's like, no, you need both. Like resilience is actually resilient because it's flexible, as you say, but it moves. It bends and it shifts. It's not this rigid, you know,
absolutely,
you know, under like pinning a strong beam or anything like that. It is flexible, as you said.
And then I think the third bit that gets belted onto resilience is that, you know, we often, at the moment of impact, we often say what we need to do is build greater resilience into people. And as leaders, I think that's probably one of the worst things that we can do at a point of pressure. So a number of my clients contacted me when COVID first hit and said, can you come and do resilience training? And in my mind, at a moment of impact like that, that's the equivalent of turning up to your first ultra marathon, calling your personal trainer and going, can you help me get fit? I'm about to start a race. At that point, you have what you have. And to have somebody, especially an expert, come along and go, you need to be more resilient and here's how. The message is you don't have enough already. And I don't think that that's true. And I don't think that it's useful. So, you know, there's times and places to build it. And I reckon one of the things that's within our control is to expose ourselves intentionally to things that are hard, to things that make us think, to things that challenge our perspective and our mindset, whether that's, you know, mentally, psychologically, whatever, physically, whatever sort of territory we want to play in there, as mini tests of, you know, how do we perform when things aren't going the way that we expect them to, or when we're in unknown territory, and that helps us to build those skills.
Yeah, I saw quite a lot of people trying to take on a lot last year, and I know certainly from you know, my own experience of, I'm in Melbourne, so we got hit a little bit harder than WA.
You certainly
quite
did,
some margin, and you know, the amount of stuff that suddenly didn't matter because I just thought, actually, it's completely out of my control, and I don't need to influence. I could sit and think about it, but I actually didn't need to. What was important, like that my family was home and we were safe. We all had a way of pretty much doing what we could when we could. But you know, if Riley wanted to not do maths one day, well, you know, she's 10. She can learn tomorrow. It's like, I'm not going to have. I'm not going to. It's not like she's, you know, 20 about to sit at her final university degree or anything. Sort of, you can learn your 9 times table tomorrow.
And you could possibly be sneaky about that and ask questions like, how many times this week have you not wanted to learn maths?
Elizabeth said, thanks for the definition around resilience and unshakable. She agrees with the term resilience as well. So sounds like you've got some converts on your mission to make resilience exactly what it should be. We should be unshakable, or shakeable and unshakable. And I think it certainly makes us stronger when we've been through something and come out the other side. But we need to be able to do both ongoing. So Mike, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for this. Mike has also very kindly shared a couple of codes to get discounts off his book. So I'll pop those in the community for people to jump in and grab one. Really worth reading, regardless of whether you're a leader of an organization or a team, or just interested for your own personal journey and how you can be more resilient as well. So team, thanks so much, Mike, for your time.